Hello and welcome to the first Critical Conversations event. Our event today is hosted by the Middle East Peace Civic Forum. My name is Matt Lakenbach, and I'm the executive director of the organization. And our team at the Middle East Peace Civic Forum and our partners have come together because at the end of the day, Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Muslims have to figure out a way to coexist and to live together. And our commitment is to effective dialogue that really makes a difference. Neither side is leaving. And to be sure, there are real issues that have to be discussed. And these include religious fundamentalism, the lack of human rights. There's also the arrogance that far too many people display that manifest as a refusal to listen to one another. And real peacemaking begins with where we are today, with an honest appraisal of the what so. Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Muslims, we have to listen to each other. We have to understand one another. And they're good-hearted people who are willing to do the work to listen to each other. And hand in hand with listening comes the responsibility for each side to articulate clearly and forcefully their needs and their grievances. Everything needs to be on the table. And it's in this vein that we created the Critical Conversation series. And for our conversation today, we've brought together two good-hearted, curious, conscious individuals who are committed to seeing the humanity in one another, one Palestinian and one Israeli. And our Palestinian guest today is Walid Siam. Welcome, Walid. Walid's family is from Ashkelon, originally in what is today the state of Israel. And as refugees in 1948, his family went to Gaza and Qatar. And Walid's journey has taken him to Tunisia, to Ramallah, and most recently to Egypt. Welcome, Walid. And our Israeli guest today is Yehuda HaKohen. Yehuda is a resident of the settlement of Beit El near Ramallah in the West Bank. And Yehuda will share about his journey to becoming a peacemaker, someone interested in dialogue and on a quest for reconciliation. And to some people, it would be considered a sacrilege to even appear at an event today like this and to communicate with one another. And yet here we are, which is a demonstration that there are really good people who are willing to engage in that kind of conversation. And for our conversation today, Walid and Yehuda have agreed to really listen to each other and to demonstrate that they hear and understand what the other is saying. Each will listen and have the opportunity to ask questions. Their intention is not necessarily to reach agreement, but first and foremost, to comprehend and demonstrate their understanding of one another. And that's our intention, to hear and to embrace the humanity in one another. And along with their commitment to real listening, Walid and Yehuda have the opportunity to be powerful advocates for their people, to say what needs to be said as they see it. And we're joined today by a very special moderator, our facilitator, Mr. Bill Phillips. Bill is an Englishman who resides in Dublin, Ireland, and as a strictly neutral party, Bill's focus is on what Walid and Yehuda want and what is possible. And our process is to discover what they have in common as human beings and what they need for a peaceful and productive existence. We're under no illusion that one conversation will resolve the generational conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. Obviously, this is the beginning of a journey, but we do believe that this is the time for conversation to start and about what a viable future looks like that recognizes both the rights and responsibilities of all people between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. So thank you for everyone who is here today live or watching the recorded conversation later. Thank you for joining in this important discussion. And thank you, Walid and Yehuda, for being here today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Matt. Let's just set some kind of ground rules for the conversation to make it easier. So one thing I want to say is we're going to be listening in a very special way, and it's really not a debate. So it's not that you're commenting on the other person's speech. You can only ask questions for clarification. So that's the only response there is. There's no room for disagreeing, apologizing, or commenting. And if a comment arises, just acknowledge the feeling, but don't act it out. In other words, keep listening, because that's important. Also, listen to their feelings that they talk about, because it may well be that they trigger off strong feelings in you. If that happens, then acknowledge where in your body you feel that. So in other words, forget the name of the feeling, but notice the physical feeling, acknowledge it, but keep listening. And that's really important. And also, if you want to respond or to comment, don't do it. Just hold on to it and keep listening, because otherwise, if you begin to comment, you'll stop listening, because you'll be following your own train of thought, not the others. So is that okay with you if we begin along that vein and see how we go?
What did I just do?
And by the way, I don't expect that we'll actually finish the conversation today. I think we'll begin the conversation, but that's okay. All right, so please begin. Who wants to start, Walid or Yehuda?
I can start. Well, by first of all, thank you for giving us, or giving me and everyone attending this opportunity. I want to abide with what you just shared with Ms. Bell, but when Matt introduced me, I felt somehow the need to add my own input, because he identified my family originally coming from Ashkelon, which is true. But Ashkelon is the Hebrew name. Asqalan is the Arabic name. And I feel it's truly important to include both terminologies in order not either of us to be or feel dismissed. I think that's something worth mentioning. Another thing Matt forgot to mention about me is that I have also lived in Gaza as well. So I was one of those few people who were lucky enough to be on the two wings of the Palestinian territories, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And since I started by talking about the importance of not dismissing the other, by trying to be impartial and transparent. The core issue, the way I see it from my experience and from my angle, is that both narratives, they save no effort in their attempt to eliminate the other, whether that the Palestinian narrative or the Israeli narrative. Sure, there are many elements that contribute to the righteousness of that narrative, but to be deemed as a healthy narrative, it should include the other and not dismiss them. I feel that's important, and that's why one of the reasons why I'm attending this meeting and taking part of it is that I am recognizing the other, and I'm prepared and I'm willing to engage with it and find a common ground for us to be able to find not necessarily a solution, but at least pave the way for it and help people change their mind and reconsider their original positions, where they can take a step closer towards each other. That's why I'm here, and I would love to hear Yehuda now.
Just before he does, you were going to begin by talking about the history of how you met, and I think that's perfectly agreeable. And by the way, you don't both have to speak at the moment, so one of you can just say what you have to say and then hand over to the other. So we'll do it like that, okay?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, would you like to lead off about how you met?
Absolutely. I just hope you don't judge me by my ability to narrate a story. But here it goes.
Yeah, one thing I would say is there is no judgment here. That's the whole point, that there is no judgment at all. We're just listening. Okay.
That's great. That's good to hear. Well, I was in Ramallah the past year, and I started engaging with peace institutions, and one of those peace institutions is called Roots. So one of its founding members is called Rav Hanan. I met him and we spoke, and he suggested introducing me to someone, and I was open to it. And he gave me his name, Yehuda HaKohen, his phone number on WhatsApp. I contacted him and we agreed to meet. And us meeting was a surreal experience, at least for me, because he lives in Beit El, which is on the northern part of Ramallah city where I used to live. And it's a surreal experience because between the roundabout where I was waiting for him and his roundabout, which is the entrance for Beit El, is less than 10 minutes walk. But at the same time, it felt like two parallel universes where the journey of me reaching him from my roundabout to his roundabout felt like a wormhole or a black hole where things were shattering. As I was crossing the checkpoint, which is the DCO checkpoint, and for anyone familiar with that checkpoint, it's different in the sense that there's nothing Palestinian after the checkpoint. It's just Beit El, the Israeli settlement, and then it's just empty land. So it's impossible for Palestinians to walk because it will be suspicious and it will bring attention in a very negative way. And that's exactly what happened, because as I was crossing, I went to the other side, across from the soldiers, because I didn't want to spook them off if I went and walked next to them. Still, they started yelling at me, asking me where I'm going. I responded in English, telling them that I'm meeting someone over there. And at the same time, Palestinians also were driving through that checkpoint, were also asking me if I need a ride, where I'm going. It basically, it didn't make any sense for any individual to just walk through that checkpoint. And once I reached the roundabout and I saw Yehuda and identified his car, it was the first time for me to actually engage with the settler in that manner. So I saw him with that stereotype, religious Jew, and I just opened the door of his car and I jumped in and I asked him to move quickly. Perhaps he can carry on.
Okay, let's do that, Yehuda.
So I apologize. I already have a very small disagreement with Walid, and that's just that he said he's not a good storyteller. I think so far he's been telling the story quite well. We drove. I actually live on a mountain next to Beit El. It's what they call the illegal outposts. You know, it's just a caravan on a mountain just north of Beit El. So what we did is we drove through Beit El. I believe it was Walid's first time driving through Beit El, and I imagine he was feeling a little bit apprehensive on the drive. It was his first time really going into a West Bank Jewish town. One of the things everybody's going to probably realize about me by the end of this event is that I avoid as much as possible the word settlement and also the word settler. And we can discuss why. And I mean, the short answer would be that I work very hard to try and avoid living as a settler, even though I'm determined and committed to living in the West Bank as a Jew. So that's a conversation I'm happy to open later on in the event if anybody's interested. But we're driving through Beit El, and we drive out the other end and up the mountain. And I could tell that Walid's a little uncomfortable, but I'm not really sure what I could say to make him feel more comfortable. I do try to reassure him, and we end up going into my house. I forget who was there. I think my wife was there. I don't know how many of my children were home at the time. I have 8 so far, Bli and Hara. I don't know how many of them were there or who was awake and who was sleeping. But we went into I guess what we can call kind of like my, it's like a back porch kind of. It's where I usually build a sukkah. And we just sat and talked, looking at the view. I think the sun was setting around then, or the sun had just set. And as the conversation progressed, I don't even remember exactly what we spoke about, but what I do remember is the feeling that as the conversation progressed, the tensions seemed to subside, and whatever whatever apprehensive energy I was feeling from Walid kind of dissipated, and the conversation just became friendlier and more honest as we continued. And at a certain point, we finished, and I gave him a ride back, and here we are.
Thank you. Now, do you want to continue, or do you want to continue, Walid? What's your preference?
If I may continue describing the discomfort I was having when I jumped into his car, and he took the roundabout and just like went back to Beit El, because in my mind, I assumed that we would be meeting in neutral turf, basically in the street or whatever. And then we got inside Beit El itself, and I asked Yehuda, where are we going? He told me we're going to his house. So I felt even more discomfort, and I felt, what am I doing here? Am I doing something crazy? Something didn't feel right. And I remember trying to start a conversation with Yehuda and asked him, like, what do you think of this place? He told me, and building on it, and he told me this is state land. So I was like, okay, this is going to be a bumpy ride. But when we start talking, like when we sat down, I saw his little daughter, she's a beautiful daughter. And to my surprise also is that that caravan where he lives, it's not within the boundary of Beit El, but somehow it's also within its boundaries. So it was a little bit confusing to me. But as we sat and spoke, and we opened our minds and for our hearts to start opening to each other, that's when comfort and stability and some kind of trust started to grow. That's what I wanted to add.
Okay, good. So go on, because now let's talk about what did you talk about, or what are you going to talk about now?
Well, we definitely addressed the whole position of the Israeli towns, settlements, whatever you want to call them, in the West Bank. We also spoke about the mentality and rationale of both peoples, and how is it possible for us to help bridge that gap, because we both agreed that both our societies need to change how they see things and how they see the other, and the necessity to accept the other. I felt that in Yehuda, and that's why I felt that trust growing. It was that seed of trust, is that he saw me as an equal. And for an Israeli to see me as an equal, that is priceless, because that is the key for whatever solution, political solution that could be done or applied in any foreseeable future, is coming from equality. And as soon as that element is there, the rest will be just details to be filled. But the most important element was equality. And Yehuda gave me that, because I treated him as an equal, naturally, and he reciprocated that respect. Because equality is about respect at the end of the day. So we were able to respect each other as individuals. And from that, we continued our communication. And here we are now.
Do you want to take over, Yehuda?
Sure. I don't know how much you want me to stay within the lines of this story, or if you want me to branch out into other topics, or my own story.
Yeah, I think it's whatever you choose in terms of you know, what's going to develop the discussion. So by all means, if you want to change it, you can do that.
So Walid touched on a lot of issues that I think are important to unpack. You know, question of narratives, questions of equality. I think that what became very clear to me at a certain point living here is that Jews and Palestinians in this land are understanding the conflict completely different. We don't just understand the conflict completely differently. We understand national identity differently. We have different conceptions of national identity. We have different understandings of history. When it comes to our history together in this land, we're living in completely different stories. We're not occupying the same story. We're each, I guess it's very similar to, like, I guess you could say, like The Wizard of Oz on the one hand and then Wicked on the other, where, you know, it's like the same story but in reverse, but it's actually a different story. And we're not even actually in each other's stories. We're for the most part not fighting each other. When we fight, we're fighting our fantasy antagonist of the other. And I would argue that one of the primary barriers to reconciliation, and even moving forward towards reconciliation, even small steps forward, one of the primary barriers is this, what I would define as a principled resistance on both sides to understanding the identity and the story and the pain and the experiences and the aspirations of the other. I think that there's a feeling on both sides of this that if we validate or engage with the narrative or identity of the other, it's going to somehow invalidate or threaten our own story. And I think that, I mean, maybe part of the problem here is that a certain, there's a component to our conflict that is not military or even physical. It's information, it's propaganda on social media, on university campuses, online. And I think that because maybe, this is just a thought that occurred to me now, maybe because so many of us are engaged in this like propaganda war or the propaganda component of this conflict, it creates more barriers, psychological barriers, to being able to hear the story of the other, because sometimes I think it's very natural for people to confuse their own side's propaganda with their actual story. And they're not always the same. And it's very easy, I think, especially when tensions are so high. I just want to point out that Walid and I met before the violence of Simchat Torah, of October 7th, and everything that's happened since. We met in the summertime. So it should be clear that this is something that occurred in a very different context than the context that exists today. And I think that's important. You know, I find that I'm actually probably a little bit more in touch with Palestinian friends than some of the other Israelis who do this kind of work. I think a lot of this work seems to have stopped since the war broke out. I think it's just difficult for people to sometimes, I guess we can say, multitask with our emotions, or you know, or our positions. And I understand the challenge. I think that for me, you know, one of the things that I think was very liberating for me on this journey was, you know, I'm very focused on trying to identify what the next stages of Jewish liberation are. Like, I would relate to Zionism as a very imperfect, very flawed Jewish liberation movement that succeeded where several Jewish liberation movements before it failed. But one of the ways it succeeded was really by utilizing tools of colonialism. And I'm not sure it could have succeeded without that. And it achieved a lot for us. I mean, the situation of the Jewish people today is radically different from our situation 150 years ago. But at the same time, it made a pretty big mess and created some problems for a lot of people. So I think that now that I would identify us as living in a post-Zionist era. I think Zionism finished. And for me, I'm very focused on trying to identify the next stages of Jewish liberation. And for me, a lot of that is trying to figure out ways to clean up Zionism's mess, correct its flaws, while protecting what I consider to be its positive achievements. And that's obviously very complicated. And one of the objectives of Jewish liberation that I've identified for now, for this stage, for this chapter of history, is reconciliation with Palestinians. Another one is actually independence from the United States. I don't think Israel can move forward with or without Palestinians, without complete independence from the United States. And the third thing I've identified is decolonizing Jewish identity. I think that it's very important for any people that achieves liberation to undergo a post-colonial process afterwards. For us, for the Jewish people, I think it's even more crucial because we have so many traumatic layers of traumatic colonization that we experienced not only in our own land, but even in exile. And I'm specifically referring to Ashkenazi Jews, Jews who spent the last couple thousand years in Europe, because I think we, including myself, my family were in Europe, Eastern Europe, primarily for the last couple thousand years, and we haven't healed from what we experienced. We haven't unpacked any of it. We haven't addressed any of it. We've tried to cover it up, maybe with power. We have power for the first time in 2,000 years, but we haven't healed. And I think it's crucial we do, for us and for the Palestinians who are under us, because I think a lot of this conflict and a lot of the way the conflict has evolved is very much due to a lot of unhealed trauma on our part. And so I think we have a big responsibility for ourselves and for the Palestinians to really try to address that. And I don't think decolonization is only about healing from trauma. I think it's also about trying to formulate what kind of society we're trying to create now that we have political independence and power for the first time. What do we want to do with that? What is our vision for our land, for the entire world? What kind of world do we want to see? My feeling is that every time the Jews have had power in history, we've done things to benefit human civilization. I don't think now should be any different. But the problem is we're still very much thinking on defense. We're very much, I think we have a bunker mentality. We see ourselves as, I think we experience ourselves in many ways as the powerless Jews of the exile. And I think one of the ways anti-Semitism works systemically as a system of oppression is it creates this reality where we, the Jews, always think of ourselves as punching up, even though everybody around us sees us as punching down. And that's something that I think is very central to what's going on and what needs to be addressed. But anyway, what I meant to say with all this was that one of the ways, one of the things that this decolonization discourse kind of brought my attention to is the fact that, unlike Western civilization, which tends to think in very dualistic terms, I discovered that Hebrew civilization, our civilization, has a much more paradoxical approach to logic, where ostensibly conflicting truths or ostensibly conflicting versions of events can both be simultaneously true. This is frequently expressed in our Talmud, in the Kabbalistic writings. I think this is like an authentically Jewish way of looking at the world, of looking at politics, looking at history, looking at social issues. And so for me, it was actually very inspiring to discover that there might be something hidden in my own people's identity that we can unearth and use to better engage with Palestinians in a way where it's not our truth versus their truth, but rather where one has to be correct and one has to be incorrect, but rather two equally valid truths that are really together part of a larger truth that includes both. And I think that so for me, that was actually very exciting, discovering that there are ideas and frameworks hidden in my own identity that I had to unearth using these post-colonial tools, and that brought me to a stage where I felt capable of holding both my people's story and the Palestinian story in a way that seems to, at least in my mind and in my experience, seems to coexist harmoniously.
Thank you. I'm noticing signals from Walid that there's some of what you said he agrees with. Maybe we should see what his point of view is now. So thank you. Walid, over to you.
Thank you. Well, that's one of the main reasons why me and Yehuda were able to connect, is that we both shared that desire for peace, but not only that, we also shared the desire to clean our own houses for us to be able to have that peace. That was one crucial meeting point where him and I share. Now, he spoke of how he's going to clean his house. It's not like my business. I can only help if he asked for my help. And I also have the responsibility to clean my own house and all the negativity that has piled up throughout the years. And that's why I engaged with Yehuda, because I was a Palestinian living in the West Bank, desperate, trying to find any possible way to ease the life of my countrymen and my life as well. So, and with desperate times come desperate measures. So I took the decision, okay, I will go to the lion's den. And by the lion's den, I mean the complete opposite of what Palestinian is. And that's a right-wing Israeli who lives in the West Bank. I know the word settlement can be triggering to you, Yehuda, because it might feel that it's dismissing your connection to the land, and that's not my intention here at all. I'm just following the international law norms. And other than sharing the desire for cleaning the house, so I went with the aspiration of asking Yehuda's help. How do you think we can halt or slow down the violence coming from Israelis in the West Bank? Because prior to October 7th, and since the beginning of 2003, there was a surge in violence coming from the settlers towards Palestinians. So all what I had in mind was how can I slow it down? How can I prevent it? So I had this idea of just like going and meeting one of those people, one of the others. And I was surprised with the amount of flexibility and how well he received me and how well he understood the Palestinian position, to the point that he tickled a dream of mine, which is going back to Asqalan, Ashkelon. And he told me he doesn't mind me going back there. That was a jaw-dropping moment for me. It was a surprise. because to hear such words from this kind of man, it was kind of paradoxal and confusing to the point that I wasn't able to comprehend, like, is he genuine or not? But with the days, I was able to reach the conclusion that indeed he is genuine. As for the trauma and the healing, and are the Jewish people able to heal from their historical trauma? I can't answer that. That's the Jewish people business. I can also only offer my help by helping them heal. And I help them heal by helping my people heal as well. I don't want to dwell who caused whose drama, and Palestinians saying that it's not us, and Israelis saying, no, it's you, added to what's been before. That's the chicken or the egg conversation, and it's not going to help. But I believe that the true purpose of this meeting and any other meeting of this kind is to actually help each other, understand each other, for us to be able to heal. So, as I said, perhaps the word or the term settlement triggers you. Again, as it might dismiss your connection to the land, but again, this is the international law perspective, etc., with United Nations resolutions. You also spoke of the propaganda, the misinformation. Absolutely, I agree with you completely. How people are being blinded to be funneled towards hating each other, being angry at each other is indescribable. We have an establishment on both sides that is purposefully and strategically doing that in a systematic way. Again, trying to eliminate the other, as if there is no possibility for Palestinians and Israelis to be at peace, as if one of us is alien and the other is human, while in fact both of us are humans. We both want the same things. We both want to have a decent life for ourselves and for our children. We want a better future for our children to grow in and prosper economically in education, etc., etc. We just want to live normally and have the good life and have the life that we try to build for ourselves. And that's what we're trying to do here. It's trying to build communication, building a common ground for us to be able to live that future in our lifetime, if we are able to accomplish it. And if we're not able to, then at least we have paved the way for our children to be able to reach that desired outcome. Because I am sure, I don't have children, but I'm certain that Yehuda is also planting that seed of common existence and accepting the other within his children as well. I'd like to believe that because he's a good man, and I believe he's raising his children in a very, very good manner. And that seed is to be planted, not just with his children, but with as many children as possible. Same thing for me, although I don't have children, but I talk to my peers, I talk to my family, I talk to my society, to my people, and try to rationalize things with them to reach a conclusion that I believe it's very important, is that the way for liberation comes from engaging with the people who are oppressing. Because no matter how hard you try to get people from outside to interfere, no, it's us who have the problem. It's us who have to solve it. And yes, again, going back to the ideologies and Zionism, what Yehuda has just mentioned, I sincerely believe that the elements or the factors or actors that have contributed in the fire, in igniting the fire of this conflict and this chaos, I sincerely believe that they cannot be part of putting out that fire and finding the solution. And that goes to ideologies, individuals, and anything beneath under it. And then I hit the wall of how difficult it is to just put aside all that logic and rationale that was absorbed by by the two peoples. So I started to find to look for a way that can help amend both narratives for them to evolve enough to accept the other. It's not an easy task, and It requires patience and being completely impartial and objective by being fair. Both sides exaggerate. Both sides are flawed. Both sides now are daring to accuse each other of being Nazis. But if we're approaching this from an equal perspective or an equality perspective, either both are Nazis or not. Because honestly, the actions and the way our people are behaving right now, it's not nice. It's ugly. And we have to stop that, and we have to change that by asking ourselves and asking our people to look at the mirror and to see the reflection of our thinking and our actions, that it's not going to lead us anywhere. Because like you said, Matt, at the very beginning of this introduction, is that we are here to stay. None of us is leaving. Yes, Yehuda mentioned how Zionism started with colonialism. I can't disagree there. But at the same time, there has been some kind of evolution. Yes, Yehuda is not satisfied with it, nor should he. But it has transformed after 75 years, that Israel has established itself, has founded itself on the ground as a nation state, unfortunately an ethno-state. But I believe with the efforts of people like Yehuda, it can evolve and do better. And I'd like to think that with the efforts of people like me in my community, in my society, we can improve and do better.
Thank you, Walid. Have you got a rejoinder to that, Yehuda?
Yeah, I think as we're progressing, I think I feel like it might be helpful to share my understanding of what a narrative is, because I think, you know, we talk about narratives, and like most of these words, I think we often find that when we have these conversations, especially when we're not all living in the same political echo chamber, and we're coming from different parts of the world and different political backgrounds, it's often the case that words mean different things. I mean, a great example might be the word Zionism, but we can address that later if people would like. I think the word narrative for me, the way I would define it, is a collection of facts that are selectively chosen, organized to tell a story, and contextualized within an ideological worldview. And I think when it comes to the last 104 years, I'm just going to make the assumption that the conflict began in 1920, but we can argue that it started earlier. I think that's fair. But I'm going to use 1920 for now, just because that's when the violence, the overt violence, the nationalist violence broke out. And I'd say that in the last 104 years, there are millions of facts. And both of us, I think the Israelis and the Palestinians, tend to really like the facts that help tell the stories we want to tell. And we both tend to ignore or dismiss or try to disprove the facts that complicate those stories. I think we're both doing that. And I noticed a number of years ago that even when we talk about the same events, we often center very different facts. I remember back in 2008, I was running a program at UC Berkeley, and I was having a conversation, a very heated conversation, with a young woman from the SJP, the Students for Justice in Palestine. She definitely experienced me as an enemy. And we were talking about 1948, or trying to, and I was at the time trying to make the point that the British had armed and trained and funded the Jordanian and Egyptian militaries in that conflict, that we were still kind of fighting the British in the 1948 war. And she kept yelling the number of Palestinian communities destroyed in that war. And we were really talking past each other. And at a certain point, she heard something I said, and she became very confused, and she said to me, why do you keep talking about Egypt? What does Egypt have to do with 1948? So at the time, I just became very dismissive of her. I thought she was, not worth continuing to speak to. I disengaged. I walked away, and I just thought this was an ignorant person who doesn't know. How could she not know that Egypt was a major participant in that war? And then years later, I thought about this, and I realized I didn't know how many Palestinian communities were destroyed in 1948. I don't think too many people in the Israeli government know the number. I don't think too many people in the, pro-Israel kind of like Hasbara space know the number. And that's what got me thinking that we have very different, we highlight, different facts, even when we're talking about the same event. When Israelis tell the story of 1948, the story we're telling is a story about beating back a number of Arab armies that invaded our country and tried to destroy us. And when Palestinians tell that story, my experience is that they're telling the story of the Nakba. They're telling the story of displacement and everything they lost in that conflict. And so it wasn't that she's an idiot because she didn't know that Egypt participated in that war. In her understanding of history, that's just not a very important fact. And it just is so much less prominent in her story than it is in ours, just like the number of Palestinian communities destroyed in the Nakba was so peripheral to our story. And so that was just like a good, I think, lesson for me in understanding how these different narratives work. I happen to think we're both telling the truth when we talk about ourselves, and I think we're both getting it wrong when we talk about each other, largely out of fear. I think largely there's a lot of fear, as I said before, of engaging the other as the other understands himself. But I would make the argument, and I do make this argument to a lot of Israelis and Palestinians, that even if we don't want to make peace, I don't think reconciliation is possible without being able to engage with each other's narratives. But let's argue for a moment that we don't care about reconciliation. We just want to win. Whether it's me or Walid, one of us just wants to win and defeat the other. Even that's not possible if we're not willing to engage the other as the other understands himself. Because, when we fight our fantasy of who the other is, we end up using counterproductive methods of struggle, which don't even get us, from a military perspective, don't even get us the results we're looking for. We're fighting our fantasy antagonist of the other, not who the other actually is in their own story. And until we're willing, and this is true for both of us, but until we're willing to actually look at the other as the other understands himself, as the other exists in his own story, even if we want to claim it's not true, it's still psychologically true for the other. Meaning, even, for example, if Walid or other Palestinians wanted to say, I have no connection to this land, I'm just a colonizer from Europe who created some artificial national identity or bought into some social construct of the Jewish people, and that's pushed me to do all the things that I've done in the last 20-something years and live where I live and and do what I did in the army, because I was in the army during the Second Intifada. Even if that's true, even if everything I believe is a lie, I still believe it. And millions of Israelis believe it. And even if it's not factually true, we deeply believe it is true. And that informs our behavior a lot more than whatever else, might be the real story. So I think it's crucial. I don't think there's any moving forward in any way, whether in war or in peace, without us being willing to look at the other's story as the other experiences it and understands it. And I think that's maybe what really came out when Walid and I met that night. I think just this, I think we both kind of shared a willingness and an openness to just putting aside all the nonsense and all the fear and just really being honest with ourselves and with one another.
Thank you, Yehuda. What's your comment on that, Walid?
My comment is that if only me and Yehuda can sign a peace agreement right now, because I couldn't possibly agree more with him. This whole idea of narrative and how we're cherry picking with our selective memory, what fits that narrative for us to present ourselves as the ultimate victim. Who's more of a victim? Is it the Palestinians or the Jewish Israelis? And I believe that it's a zero-sum game, because both of us are victims of ourselves and the other. Unfortunately, this is the reality. And for us to, or for myself as Walid, or Palestinians in general, for me to speak my truth does not mean I am denying yours, and vice versa for Yehuda. For him to speak his truth, for his people to speak their truth, doesn't mean that they deny mine. Because my truth is subjective, and your truth is subjective. And the real truth somehow will be somewhere in between. This is how I believe it. And for us to reach that place in between, we are ought to recognize and take responsibility for the wrongdoings that we both have done to each other. Again, I'm not going to dwell with who drew the first blood in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. But I truly believe that it is important to recognize and admit our own responsibilities to our actions, either Palestinians or Israelis. That goes to the Nakba, that goes to Palestinians resorting to violence, and their rejection for Jewish immigration back in the day, like back in the previous century, and still insisting on adopting armed resistance as the only way forward. And I completely disagree with that. I don't believe that force or the use of brute force will lead anyway. Just like Yehuda mentioned, the security measure or the security approach is not reliable. It's not going to change anything, because if it would, if it can, it would have already. And as we see now with what's happening in Gaza and the amount of brute force that is being used, it's only going to reproduce the same product or the same outcomes. And that's what we're trying to change here. By showing ourselves and showing the other and showing the others, including like internationals in this panel, for example, that no, we can talk, we can communicate, we can find and reach a common ground, we can be reasonable. And the problem is that, the way I see it, is that we are led by the extremists, even though they are a minority. And I'd make a wager that most peoples, Palestinians and Israelis, they want to live in peace, despite of how they define that peace. It's irrelevant right now. But they do seek and desire peace. And that we are allowing ourselves to be led by extremists. Why? Because they are the loudest. And I truly believe that we need to help each other, and we need the help of the outside world to strengthen such voices, such rational voices that adopt a peaceful approach towards each other, for us to be able to clean the house, to be able to live in peace eventually together. Zionism, at first, when I began this journey, because I've been a peace activist for nearly 3 years now, and for me, whenever I hear the word Zionism, I'm just triggered, because Zionism represents my trauma as a Palestinian. But throughout my journey, I was able to understand what Zionism is to the Israeli people, to the Jewish people. And there are different Zionisms. and different understandings of what Zionism is. And it's like there isn't a consistent or one size that fits all, because that's not the case at all. But for me as a Palestinian, it was a one size that fits me as the oppressed. Needless to talk about the history. History is in the books. We're trying to rechange the course, to change the course of history by writing our own lines that can hopefully be different than the ones that are in the history book. So if we are indeed to be able to change our narratives, to be able to recognize our and take accountability for our wrongdoings to the other, if we are able to see the other as an equal, because yes, it is true that I had my suspicion that maybe Yehuda, when we met, he doesn't see me as an equal, and I was proven wrong, thankfully. But we also, as Palestinians, we don't see Jews as equals, and this is stemming from the fact that us as Palestinians who are oppressed, somehow it's in the back of our heads that because we are oppressed, we are superior morally. And I don't think that's the case, because we do have our own flaws, we do have our mistakes in rationale and actions, and claiming the moral superiority, especially after October 7th, is an impossibility, at least in my eyes. I will not dwell too much in October 7th and its details, but it was a remarkable, like it was a milestone in our historical conflict, in the sense that it was unprecedented in all elements, or in all angles of what unprecedented is: violence, actions done, words spoken. All of that was never heard before. All of that was never practiced before. And the warmongering in the two societies has never happened before. So I believe in the darkest hours, that's when a beacon of light needs to share its light and try to enlighten that dark tunnel that we are right now. It's not by having two gentlemen who are reasonable, who are understanding of themselves, so that's why they are able to understand the other, to illuminate that path for others. Now, as I mentioned, there are elements to do that. We have done it individually, me and Yehuda. But for other individuals in our society to take that step and travel, because this is me leaning on Edward Said's notion, the exile and the travel, and both Israelis and Palestinians, they do share the exile, which is the Holocaust and the Nakba. So for us to travel is for the individual to abandon that stereotype narrative that demonizes the other, whereby the individual is capable of seeing things in an objective manner, in a humanitarian manner, so that he would be able to see the other as a human. Because the problem to me as a Palestinian that I kept facing in the past in my journey as a peace activist is that even with the peaceful voices, there are at some points and at some junctions, I would feel that I'm still being seen and perceived as subhuman. I'm not equal to you. And if I am able to do two things in my journey that is still continuing, I want to achieve two things. One concerning my society, and that is to keep banging on the sides of the tank and shouting as much as I can by telling them that we need to engage with Israelis in a humanitarian way, and not to demonize anyone who engages with Israelis and label them simply as normalizers. But it is within our best interest as Palestinians to engage with Israelis and speak with them, because at the end of the day, they are our neighbors and they are the ones we are supposed to live next to. That's one. Two, when it comes to the Israeli society, I really want to achieve the element of being seen as an equal. And it's not like I am begging for it. No, I'm practicing it. So for them to be able to see that, and with what I want to accomplish with my society, I believe my journey will be satisfactory, at least in my views.
Thank you, Walid. Do you think maybe we should suspend it there in terms of having rounded off this discussion and maybe just talk now about how we feel with this discussion to finish the debate? Would that be good?
I'm okay with that.
So from here, then let's turn it into a debate or a discussion rather than this listening. So thank you both for the work you've done so far, and certainly for this conversation. I'm sure this is the beginning. So over to you, Matt, maybe.
Very good. So you talked about opening it up to how Walid and Yehuda feel. Is that?
Yeah, just
Yeah.
anything now. So a discussion rather than listening.
Sure. And if anyone would like to ask a question, you can drop a question in the chat and we can bring that forward. Yeah, Yehuda, what does this conversation make you feel?
Well, I'll be honest, it's not the first time I've had these conversations. So I feel hopeful, but then I turn on the news. So, you know, it's difficult, it's frustrating when I think that, you know, when I see how honestly unprepared, I think psychologically, a lot of us are unprepared. The truth is, you know, Israeli society is made up of different sociocultural tribes. I think it's a good way of understanding it. Palestinian society as well, perhaps, but I'm more of an expert in my own society. And I think it's actually a mistake to, when we look at Israeli society, I think a lot of people have a very counterproductive habit of superimposing Western political framings on Israel, like liberal, conservative, religious, secular, right, left. You know, these are words that mean something very deep in Western civilization because they're very deeply connected to Greco-Roman thought, to Christian dogma, to the revolutionary transition between feudalism and capitalism, but they have very little to do with Jewish culture, Jewish identity. And I think when applying them to Israel, they can only get you so far. I think there are a lot of tribes in Israeli society where these terms are just very unhelpful and problematic and actually become barriers to understanding what we're dealing with and what kind of people we're dealing with and what their aspirations are, what their grievances are. So I do want to, I will say a couple things, you know. First of all, there's been this idea that me as a Jew living in the West Bank and also living in the West Bank for ideological, political reasons. I want to make that clear. And maybe it's a good time to just say that the Jews living in the West Bank are not homogenous. Even the communities themselves are not homogenous. There are many different communities, types of communities, which are socioculturally diverse. I would actually say that there is a spectrum. There are two spectrums that are inverted. There's, first of all, a spectrum when looking at West Bank Jewish communities. I think there's a spectrum in terms of the extent to which these communities are living according to settler colonial structures. And there's also a spectrum in terms of how violent these communities are. And these spectrums are actually inverted. I would argue that the Jews in the West Bank who are living according to, who are really living like settlers, are the least violent. And the most violent of the Jews are those who are least living like settlers. Meaning that there are certain Jewish communities, I'm just going to name one, I'll say Efrat, which is a pretty big Jewish town, or maybe a city already, south of Jerusalem, near Bethlehem, or just kind of south of Bethlehem. And they live basically surrounded by a fence, surrounded by military protection. I don't know if they realize it, but they're for the most part monopolizing a lot of the natural resources in the area. And I would argue that Efrat is very much living according to these kind of settler structures. I would call Efrat a settlement. But the Jews living in Efrat are some of the least likely to be violent, personally, unless they're in uniform, because they, for the most part, experience the state and the army, the security forces, as protecting them. They have all these structures in place to protect them. Whereas if you go maybe to the opposite extreme, a Jewish community like Yitzhar, which exists on a village near Nablus, near Shechem, has no fence around it, doesn't have a good relationship with the army, and sees itself as pretty much a tribe living on a mountain at war with all the tribes around it. And when a couple Jews are killed driving through Hawara, the Jews of Yitzhar storm Hawara and burn it down. Right? Now, they're violent, but they're not settlers. They're not behaving according to the structures of settler colonialism, not living behind walls. They're not living behind checkpoints. They're not living behind military protection. They see themselves as totally responsible for their own security, and relate to Palestinians not as savages. They don't utilize this kind of framing of like civilized people versus savages. They just see Palestinians, at least the Palestinians in their area, as rival tribes. They're a tribe, the Palestinians are different tribes, and they're at war. And I actually think that's a much healthier dynamic, because there's so much more potential there for a better relationship. I grew up, when I grew up, I was a very rebellious kid, and I grew up in gangs, or we called crews, in New York City. And I know what it is to make peace with enemies. And in fact, some of my closest friends today are people who were sworn enemies when I was 15, 16 years old. And but sometimes, when you have an enemy that you respect, you can find a way to become friends and partners later on. That's been my experience, at least in life. And I think a lot of what I learned about politics, I learned growing up in New York, what we call pre-Giuliani New York, which I understand New York is now reverting back to a little bit. So I happen to think that the Jews living in the West Bank, even though we're not homogenous, I want to say that there's a common denominator that we all share. There's an understanding of ourselves that I think we all share. It's essentially that we're an ancient people that was displaced from this land against our will by the Romans. We somehow managed to survive for 2,000 years, pretty much in gas form. We, against all odds, came back to our land and, retook possession of it, revived our language, and started to rebuild our civilization after many centuries, which nobody else has done, to my knowledge. And now the international community wants to displace us again through a two-state solution. And that's kind of the story that most Jews living in the West Bank are living, right? That the truth is, Palestinians are very peripheral to that story. We have come to the conclusion that the best method of struggle to resist the West, the United States and its allies, the international community, from displacing us again through two-state solution, the best method of struggle we figured out is to build as many homes and communities on as many mountains as we can to make moving us logistically impossible. That's what we figured out, and not really in an effort to hurt Palestinians. When Palestinians get hurt, that's really a side effect of this, although there's also a conflict that we have with the Palestinians. But this is just what we're trying to do to prevent the international community from dividing our land, to avoid partition. And I've been a part of this. I've spent years of my life creating new Jewish communities on different mountaintops and in urban centers in East Jerusalem. And I've come to the conclusion, as somebody who's been part of this, that it's only half the battle, and that the second half needs to be uniting with certain factions in Palestinian society and being able to speak to the world in one voice about how a two-state solution is never going to work here. And the only way to move forward is through a one-state reality that A, includes Gaza, and B, allows us both to live as winners in our subjective narratives. Meaning really understanding the grievances and aspirations of both sides in order to help us win subjectively, right? We're living in our subjective narrative. Great, let's each win subjectively with one objective reality between the river and the sea that really hits all the right notes for both of us. And I think we can do that. So right now, I'm convinced, and this is maybe counterintuitive for a lot of people, that the tribe I'm a part of, the I guess what we can call the more radical, maybe a little more, by the way, I'm personally living in Beit El. I'm somewhere in the middle of both of those spectrums, somewhere in the middle of Efrat and Yitzhar, both in terms of settler structures and in terms of violence. But I think it's the Jews who live where I live. Maybe we can say from my side of the spectrum all the way to Yitzhar. I don't know if Efrat is really helpful or not. That's a different conversation. But I think what we consider to be, Walid kept mentioning the extremists. And every time he said that word, I kind of laughed on the inside, because I think most people would say I'm one of the extremists. Like, I definitely represent that camp. I often tell when groups come to my house, I say to them, I share an identity with our Minister of Finance, Bezalel Smotrich, who's one of the most, demonized Israeli politicians today, him and Ben Gvir, right? They're the extremists in Netanyahu's government. So I say, I share an identity with Smotrich, and it's true, I do. He actually grew up in my town. I share his understanding of Jewish identity. I think I share his interpretation of our Torah. I share his understanding of our connection to the land, what we came back for, what we're doing here. The difference is our political conclusions. The difference is what political path I think will achieve our ideological commitments. But we probably share a lot of the same ideological commitments. And so I really do see this sector, what we call the national religious, the West Bank Jews, the Jewish extremists. I happen to view that tribe as the most advanced sector of Israeli society. The problem is most of us still are completely blind to the Palestinians and their reality. And I'm of the belief that if this tribe, much more than Tel Aviv or other tribes in the country, I believe that if this tribe, the Jews living in the West Bank and the, let's say, more quote unquote extremist, violent, a little bit less settler, 50% of the Jews living in the West Bank, were to actually sensitize ourselves to the Palestinian story and the Palestinian experience, I believe we would be a real vanguard here and actually be able to create something new.
Thank you, Yehuda. Walid, would you like to respond to that?
Oh, absolutely. Well, I hate to jinx it, but there are a couple of points that I would beg to differ. But let me begin with what I agree with. When I went to Yehuda and we were talking, I was mesmerized and at the same time shocked with the amount of similarities that exist between both of our societies and how tribal we both are and how we function and how we think. So because like before engaging with Israelis, like this whole image of how Israel is presented as a democracy, as a civilized Western country, etc., etc. But when I saw how that's not the case by the tongue of one of its citizens, I was truly surprised. And but it wasn't as much as my surprise was when Yehuda mentioned the Efrat people and how they they don't live in that colonial construct and how they take things and take matters into their own hand.
Not
And
Yitzhar. Yitzhar.
oh,
Efrat.
pardon. Okay, pardon me, my bad, my mistake. I apologize. Yitzhar. And I remember you mentioned you labeled it as wolves seeing wolves. And that just like got stuck with me. And as much as it was surprising to me, but it made sense because the element of equality exists there. However, it exists in a non-healthy and toxic way. So the idea is to transform it into more healthier equality. Frankly, like you shared how you belong to the extremist. When I engaged with you, when I started talking with before I meet you, that's what was in my mind. I'm not gonna lie. And when I met you, you gave me error 404, honestly, because how can an extremist be like you, or speak like you, or advance whatever thoughts like you? And that's where things got more interesting and intriguing to me. Because if there is Yehuda, there is another. I'm sure there will be another Yehuda, either with Yehuda's help or without it, because I'd like to think that when people want to be rational, like uh, adopt logic and be rational, they can think differently and start singing or away from the flock. And when you say like yes, the infamous Ben Gvir and Smotrich who have been demonized, as you say, although they haven't been trying to avoid that demonization because they've been doing everything they can to do that. But at the same time, when I want to look at the extremists in my society, and let me call them Hamas or the right wing, let's try to avoid words that can trigger each other. Let's say the right wing. I hope you can accept that, Yehuda. So the right wing in both societies, they do exist. They are our people at the end of the day. I have friends who are Hamas. I know people who are Hamas. And Yehuda, this is your community, basically. So I think that one of another crucial step that we need to do is to view or to practice that equality in that sense. Because it doesn't make sense to me to have the right-wing Israelis accepted, tolerated, while the right-wing Palestinians are not. So I believe that in terms of practicing equality, it would be fair enough to view them as equals. And if we are going to proceed from there or from this point, then we can actually build something on top of it. Meaning that if Yehuda can, because I'm secular, If Yehuda, for example, can sit and speak the way we are speaking right now with someone from Hamas, the way I am speaking to you, Yehuda, someone from the Israeli right wing, other than me paying to actually see that, but I truly believe that it will be setting the wheels in motion in a faster speed, because now the two extremists are sitting together, because there is no peace if you don't deal with your enemy. And we need to have the enemies engaging in a healthy manner, in a suitable situation, whereby they can work out their differences. Me and Yehuda, maybe right now we don't have any differences, and we seem largely or greatly in harmony, which is true. But at the same time, it is about those who are not. So how are we going to provide that environment, the circumstances for them? Because from what I learned from peace activism is that it's one person at a time, one person at a time, one person at a time, by having focused conversations, not just general, and creating that rapport where a human connection is actually established, so that I'd be able to influence and be influenced as well, and learn how to do that. Right now, I don't have the answer for that question. But all I know is that I have to keep doing what I'm doing. Maybe I will help someone step out of the darkness into the light of seeking peace and actually working for peace, for it to be accomplished and to be a reality. Because for us to continue killing each other, it's us creating our own drama by ourselves, for ourselves, and for the other as well. So we have to talk some sense into our people, even if they are not ready to listen to us. We have to keep banging on the tanks of the wall, banging on the sides of the tank, I'm sorry, which is a famous quote from a novel from the famous Palestinian author Ghassan Kanafani, Men Under the Sun. We have to speak loud, because at the end of the day, as I started this meeting, I said that the extremists or the right-wingers, or the ones who are in control or in the of the steering wheel of both of our peoples, are the loudest, even though they are the minority. So we have to be louder. We have to be more active in what we do. And importantly, we have to do something on the ground. Because yes, we can keep talking, we can have such meetings, even though it is good, but it's not enough. It's not enough. We have to do something on the ground to show ourselves, our peoples, and the entire world that yes, we want to live together in peace, and that we are capable of doing so. I had this crazy idea actually after my visit and meeting Yehuda. It inspired me to this initiative, which is organizing some kind of a peaceful march, where I gather some of my people, Yehuda would gather some of his people, and we would meet at that checkpoint with just slogans of wanting to live in peace, not necessarily towards pushing or forwarding any specific political solution, even though I do agree with Yehuda, there is no place for a two-state, and we're only left with a one state or any shape or form of it in a federal form or something like that. But it would be a gesture that would deliver a shock for both of our societies that, hey, Palestinians and Israelis who are living in the West Bank, who we always label as settlers, we want to live together in peace. I was hoping for such a shock, and I was trying to work for it and make it happen. But unfortunately, I planned, and God laughs at my plan when October 7 happened. So what is the right moment? What is the right circumstance? I am clueless, but all I know is that I will do my very best to create it. And with the help of people like Yehuda, I'm sure it will happen at some point.
Walid, I think that's a really valid point at which to halt the discussion now. Do you agree with that? Because I think you've come to a very nice conclusion, which will be continued another time, I'm sure. But
Yes,
Absolutely.
yeah, thank you very much, both of you.
When will that be continued? If you don't mind me asking and interrupting.
thank you, Kellyanne. So I have a few announcements to make, including the date of our next session, our next two sessions, actually. So stand by. So as you suggested, Bill, let's wrap up the discussion there. I think this was a really terrific conversation, and Yehuda and Walid, you both brought up really excellent points about us choosing a new narrative and better understanding our mutual narratives, which are, as you said, Yehuda, there are millions of facts, and that's correct. We have to acknowledge that the factual history is quite elaborate with all sorts of facts, and now we get to determine what's next, what's the future. So so to be continued. So again, thank you both for being here today, and to our facilitator, Bill, really terrific job. I invite everyone who's watching today to visit our website. It's www.mepcf.org to learn more about the Middle East Peace Civic Forum and our theory of change. And stay tuned. You can also sign up for our newsletter on the website, or if you'd like to drop your email and name in the chat, we'll go ahead and add you to our mailing list so you can stay informed about what's happening and receive some commentary. And we certainly would love your donations to the Civic Forum. We're a fledgling organization, and your contributions will really help us move ahead and continue to engage in these valuable discussions, and to widen our audience and our impact. And our next critical conversation will be April 25th, followed by May 23rd. So they're scheduled for the fourth Thursday of each month. So that is the plan for our next events. Bill, is there anything else you'd like to say at this juncture?
No, other than I think the two gentlemen that have spoken with us have given us a lot to think about, and I think, you know, it's been honest, and that's exactly what I was hoping for. So thank you very much, and I'm sure we'll see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Bill. Thank you, Walid. Thank you, Yehuda. And thank you for everyone who joined us today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, gentlemen. I'm moved.
Thank you.
You. All right. Well, be in touch. Matt and Bill, feel free to reach out, and if we can do something again, I'd love that.
Yeah, well, we'd be happy to have you on in our next discussion and continue the conversation. And I think, as you said, Walid, it's time to just start practicing the equality, and you know, once we engage in this conversation as we are today, it goes out, and it has an impact, and it's kind of a ripple effect. We never quite know the full impact of having this kind of discussion, but it's certainly much needed in the world today.
Absolutely. And I hope that the end of the day, we can actually help reach the mind and soul and heart of someone who wasn't able to see otherwise. So I hope that we are able to illuminate a new path for him or her to take.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure as well that as we continue these discussions at a later date, it will have developed by then. New things will have happened, and therefore, you know, it won't be the same as today. So thank you for such a good beginning, I think.
All right.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. We'll reconvene soon.
Okay. See you later.
Okay.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.